my son and his bride stepped out of the wedding reception into the lights and laughter.
And never came back. It was as if they dissolved into the night.
The official investigation turned up nothing. No clues, no answers. Year after year, I learned to live with that emptiness. And then, after all this time, I realized there are truths more terrifying than not knowing anything at all.
On a summer night in 2008, before the wedding lights had even fully dimmed, Lauren Mitchell and Andrew Caldwell vanished from Illinois, as though swallowed by the darkness. Their silver Range Rover rolled out of the parking lot amid cheers and congratulations, carrying two people who had just vowed to spend their lives together in front of hundreds of witnesses. The vehicle disappeared around the bend, leaving behind a dark road and an indescribable feeling. There was no screeching of brakes, no crash, nothing that made anyone turn for a second look. By midnight, their phones remained silent, and that silence began to feel heavy. The next morning, families called in panic, their names spoken aloud in the police station duty room, then repeated in vain. Days turned into weeks, weeks into years, and the question what happened in those first hours slowly became a scar on the entire community. Every trace seemed to have been erased, as if that night had never existed. But some voids are not emptiness. They are where the truth waits to be touched. Before we dive deeper into this shocking true story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you love journeys into forgotten quests for justice, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the latest cases. The summer of 2008, Naperville, Illinois was wrapped in the gentle heat of July and golden lights stretching around the small church on the edge of town, where a wedding had just ended in a peaceful and familiar way. The reception wasn't overly loud, didn't drag on into the early hours, and had no moment that made anyone pause with concern. Lauren Mitchell and Andrew Caldwell left the venue, while many guests were still chatting inside, glasses not yet cleared away, music playing at just the right volume to fill the space. A few people remembered seeing Lauren with a light wrap over her shoulders, holding her high heels in her hand, walking slowly across the parking lot pavement that still held the day's warmth. Andrew close beside her, jingling the car keys, glancing back as if to make sure they hadn't forgotten anything. The silver Range Rover was parked near the exit, reflecting the surrounding lights, new enough to stand out from any other vehicle. The last witness confirmed the time as around 10 o'clock at night, confirmed it was that exact car leaving the lot heading west on the side road, not speeding, not turning sharply, no sign of hurry. It was a completely ordinary departure from a reception, not memorable enough for anyone to hold on to longer than a few seconds. That night passed quietly. No one returned to the church for forgotten items. There were no calls reporting traffic incidents in the area, no reports of an accident involving that vehicle. When morning came, the silence continued. Both families waited for a call saying they had arrived at their honeymoon spot, but Lauren's phone didn't ring, and neither did Andrew's. The first calls were made with the patients left over from a long night, thinking perhaps they were sleeping in or hadn't turned their phones on yet. When they contacted the lodging that had been mentioned before the wedding, the front desk confirmed no couple had checked in under their names the night before. Morning turned to afternoon in increasingly heavy waiting. Families began calling Lauren and Andrew's closest friends, asking if anyone had received a message, if anyone had been told about a change of plans. All the answers were the same: no one had heard anything. By early afternoon, a few people returned to the church area and nearby parking lots, asking the valet staff, asking nearby residents, hoping someone had seen the Range Rover return or park somewhere overnight. No one saw anything beyond the confirmed departure moment. The vehicle didn't appear in public parking lots around town. No tickets, no reports of an abandoned car on the roadside. Initial assumptions gradually lost credibility. If they went on honeymoon, why no word? If they changed plans, why not take essential items? If just delayed, why the silence all day? The afternoon passed with repeated calls, longer silences, and the feeling that time was slipping away. As the sun began to set, the worry could no longer be covered with reassurances. Families gathered, comparing what was certain, the time they left the reception, the vehicle used, not returning to the lodging, no contact since the wedding night. Those details were repeated, as if arranging them in the right order would make the answer appear. But nothing changed. By evening, the decision was made that waiting any longer was no longer reasonable. Families called the local police, reporting that Lauren Mitchell and Andrew Caldwell had been missing since the night before, whereabouts unknown, no indication they were safe or had left voluntarily. That call ended a long day, with the acknowledgement that this absence was no longer an ordinary delay, but something entirely different, just beginning to take shape, but no one yet knew what to call it. The family's call was received at the Naperville police station in the late evening, nearly a full day after Lauren Mitchell and Andrew Caldwell left the wedding. Initial information was recorded according to standard procedure for a missing persons report: identities of the two individuals, ages, relationship, last confirmed sighting, vehicle used, and the family's unsuccessful contact attempts over many hours. At the time of intake, the case did not yet have enough factors to be classified as highest priority. Both missing persons were adults, with no history of running away, no public signs of stress before the wedding, and the possibility that they had spontaneously changed honeymoon plans without telling anyone was still considered. However, the prolonged silence beyond expectations meant the file was not treated as a routine delay. A report was filed that same night, a case number assigned, and an on-duty detective was designated to oversee it. Right from the intake stage, the family was asked to provide all information related to post-wedding plans, including previously mentioned locations, possible routes taken, and a list of people who might know the couple's schedule in advance. Details about the silver Range Rover were recorded thoroughly: license plate, year, condition, and ownership history. This data was entered into the internal system for cross-referencing if the vehicle appeared in any other reports. At this stage, an initial risk assessment was conducted based on standard criteria: length of no contact, context of disappearance, personal history, and prior warning signs. The result placed the case at medium risk, with a note for continuous monitoring over the next 24 to 48 hours. The next morning, with no further contact from Lauren or Andrew, the file was reviewed again. The fact that the couple never arrived at their intended lodging, combined with both phones showing no signal for an extended period, prompted reconsideration of raising the risk level. Though there was not yet enough evidence to treat this as an urgent violent incident, the shift commander decided to move the case to active investigation status. A small investigative team was formed, consisting of a lead detective, a support officer specializing in data collection and processing, and a family liaison officer to ensure consistent information exchange and avoid misunderstandings or missed details. Forming the team early reflected the judgment that this disappearance, while lacking clear criminal indicators, contained enough unusual elements to warrant more than passive monitoring. The team's first step was to precisely establish the last confirmed sighting, the time and place where Lauren and Andrew's presence was independently verified, not based on speculation. Statements from wedding guests, church staff, and parking attendants were collected and cross-checked. The data showed a consistent time of around 10 o'clock at night, in the parking lot behind the church, when the couple got into the silver Range Rover and drove off west on the side road. No statements indicated they stopped to talk to anyone else, returned to the reception hall, or changed vehicles at the last minute. Establishing a clear last sighting allowed investigators to eliminate a range of vague hypotheses and focus on a specific time frame. From that point, the disappearance window was temporarily narrowed, starting from when the vehicle left the lot until the family realized they couldn't make contact the next morning. This period was marked in the file as the critical time frame, because any activity or data outside it would be less likely directly related to the disappearance. Narrowing the time was not to pinpoint exactly what happened, but to create a logical boundary, so the investigation didn't spread too thin and lose focus from the start. In parallel with establishing the timeline, the team began initial geographic scoping. Based on the church location, possible routes the Range Rover might have taken after leaving the lot were listed, including main roads out of Naperville and side roads connecting to nearby areas. This scoping was directional, not to confirm a specific route, but to prepare for systematic tracing later. Areas too far or incompatible with the established time frame were deprioritized to focus resources on the most reasonable possibilities. Throughout the activation phase, decisions were made cautiously and sequentially, reflecting the standard approach to a disappearance without direct criminal evidence. The family was updated on the case status and steps being taken, and asked to report immediately any new information, no matter how small. There was no public announcement at this point, and the case remained handled internally by authorities, assuming the silence might soon be explained by non-criminal reasons. However, even in the early official investigation phase, one key observation was noted in the file: this disappearance left no clear starting point for tracing beyond the moment they left the parking lot, and there was no evidence confirming Lauren and Andrew were in verifiable safety. The absence of normal signs, like a call saying they were delayed, a message about changed plans, or any communication, prevented the case from being dismissed as a simple delay. It was precisely that lack of information, more than any specific detail, that kept the file open and forced the team to monitor closely, ready to adjust the assessment if subsequent data changed the nature of the case. Once the timeline and last confirmed sighting were established, the investigative team moved to the public infrastructure tracing phase, focusing entirely on automated recording systems outside the personal lives of Lauren Mitchell and Andrew Caldwell. The goal of this phase was to answer one question: where did the silver Range Rover go after leaving the church parking lot, and was there any objective trace recording that movement? The work started with what was closest. City-managed traffic cameras within a few-mile radius of the church were reviewed for the narrowed time frame, prioritizing major intersections and routes leading out of the central area. Investigators weren't looking for detailed images or clear plates, understanding the technical limits of local cameras at the time. Instead, they sought the presence of a vehicle with matching characteristics moving in the appropriate direction at the right time. Hours of footage were fast-forwarded, marked and compared. Some vehicles of similar size and color appeared, but when time and direction were checked, they were quickly ruled out. No footage showed the Range Rover leaving the area via major monitored routes in the immediate post-wedding window. This result was not conclusive, but it eliminated the possibility the vehicle traveled through the most heavily monitored roads. In parallel with traffic cameras, the team checked electronic toll station data on highways connecting Naperville to surrounding areas. The data was queried by plate and time frame, expecting that if the vehicle left via highway, at least one record would appear. The results showed no matching records, no toll transactions, no automatic passes, no matching data. The absence at toll stations significantly reduced the likelihood the Range Rover left the area via major highways, though it didn't completely rule out side roads or toll-avoiding routes. Next, public parking lots in the area were checked, including those near shopping centers, train stations, and high-traffic zones. Lot managers were asked about vehicles left overnight or beyond normal limits, and entry-exit records were reviewed where available. There were no reports of an unclaimed silver SUV, no vehicles impounded for overstaying that matched the Range Rover description. Additionally, the team worked with infrastructure units to check entry-exit data for gated communities and large public facilities. These systems, though not citywide, could provide indirect information about whether a vehicle passed a specific checkpoint. Again, the results yielded no leads. No record showed the Range Rover at these checkpoints in the relevant time frame. Each negative result was carefully documented, because they weren't just missing data, they were pieces that gradually narrowed reasonable possibilities. As the search widened, the team reviewed traffic accident reports in the area and nearby routes for the relevant period. The goal was to see if any incident, even minor, might involve a silver SUV. Reports were cross-checked by time, location and vehicle type. No accidents matched, no unidentified towed vehicles, no hit-and-run reports involving that car. This made the hypothesis of a public detectable accident less likely. During public infrastructure tracing, investigators also considered the possibility the Range Rover didn't follow typical predicted routes. Side roads, less monitored turns, and areas without cameras were noted as gaps in the overall picture. However, the complete lack of any trace on major monitored systems remained noteworthy. If the vehicle had moved through busy areas or used common public infrastructure, at least one indirect trace usually existed. Here, the near-total absence of objective records made the picture unusual. At the end of this tracing phase, the team compiled all collected data. Traffic cameras showed no clear movement of the Range Rover after leaving the lot. Toll stations had no matching data. Public parking lots found no abandoned vehicle. Area access control systems recorded no appearance of the car. Traffic accident reports provided no connection. All results were consistent in one direction and monitored public space. The Range Rover left almost no trace after the wedding departure.
This finding was clearly noted in the file as a temporary conclusion of the public infrastructure tracing phase. It didn't state how the vehicle vanished, but it ruled out many common scenarios and forced the team to acknowledge that any movement, if it occurred, avoided typical recording systems. The lack of traces in public space also meant there was no basis yet to determine a specific route or intermediate stop after the couple left the lot. At this point, the investigation had not yet touched personal data or the private lives of Lauren and Andrew. All conclusions were based on what public infrastructure could or could not record. It was precisely that confirmed absence of data, verified across multiple independent systems, that made this phase significant. It provided no answers, but it confirmed the answers would not lie in the familiar public spaces where most disappearances leave traces. When tracing public infrastructure yielded no signs whatsoever of the Range Rover's route, the investigation team shifted to another layer of data, more private and personal, yet still within the bounds permitted for a missing persons case being handled under standard procedures. The focus of this phase was on digital traces directly tied to Lauren Mitchell and Andrew Caldwell, data generated passively in everyday life that typically leaves a clear trail of activity when someone travels or makes intentional decisions. The work began with both of their cell phones. Through the carrier, investigators requested extraction of basic activity history within the identified time frame, including the last connection to the network, device status, and any calls or messages initiated. The results showed that both phones functioned normally until shortly before leaving the wedding, after which no further activity was recorded. There were no outgoing calls, no successfully connected incoming calls, no messages sent or received, and no indication that the devices were powered back on after being turned off. Cell tower connection logs did not show prolonged movement across multiple areas. Instead, the signal lingered briefly in one spot before disappearing. This data was not detailed enough to pinpoint an exact location, but it revealed one key fact: Lauren's and Andrew's phones were not used after the time of disappearance, and there was no evidence they attempted to maintain contact or switch devices. Concurrently with the phone checks, the team reviewed bank accounts and payment cards in both names. Personal accounts were examined for the period before and after the wedding night, with necessary permissions from family.
Transactions prior to the wedding aligned with wedding preparations, payments for services, small purchases, and daily expenses. After leaving the reception, the data stream abruptly stopped. There were no cash withdrawals, no card payments, no expenditures for fuel, food, lodging, or any other services. The complete absence of financial transactions over multiple days was highly unusual. In cases of voluntary departure, even without notice, there is typically at least some financial trace, however minor. Here, the data showed both accounts had effectively frozen completely since the wedding night. The team next examined Lauren's and Andrew's online accounts, including email, social media, and common personal services of the time. The goal was not to analyze private content, but to determine whether any logins, logouts, or status changes occurred after the disappearance. The review found no new activity recorded, no emails sent, no emails opened after the last known time. Social media accounts showed no status updates, no interactions, no logins from new devices or IP addresses. The total lack of any online trace over many days further reinforced the assessment that Lauren and Andrew did not actively use digital communication channels after leaving the wedding. Another factor considered was accounts related to travel and daily needs, such as bookings, rentals, or utilities they might have used if changing plans at the last minute. Queries were run using both names and personal details, but no transactions or service requests arose after the established time. No new bookings, no rental confirmations, no signs they had prepared for extended travel or altered known schedules. When these data layers were combined, a consistent picture emerged. Digitally, Lauren Mitchell and Andrew Caldwell essentially vanished at the same moment. Phones stopped functioning, bank accounts showed no transactions, online accounts had no usage signs, and no data indicated they continued normal activities elsewhere. This did not fit the scenario of voluntary departure, especially since neither took essentials for a long trip and left no messages for family or friends. The team carefully documented these findings in the case file, while avoiding speculation beyond the evidence. Lack of digital activity does not automatically imply foul play, but it ruled out several common possibilities. If Lauren and Andrew had left intentionally, they would need at least minimal interaction with financial or communication systems, unless extraordinarily prepared. Here, the data showed no such preparation. Pre-wedding activities did not reflect plans to disappear, and the sudden cutoff of all digital traces coincided exactly with the disappearance. Another key point noted was the perfect synchronization between the two. No data showed one continuing activity, while the other went silent. Both ceased all digital engagement almost simultaneously. This made scenarios like one leaving first, or one encountering trouble, while the other continued less plausible. The synchronization suggested whatever happened to Lauren and Andrew occurred in the same time frame, under similar conditions. At the end of the personal data tracing phase, the team compiled results and updated the case assessment. Public infrastructure systems recorded no vehicle movement after the wedding. Personal data systems recorded no activity after the same point. These two independent layers led to a provisional conclusion from the moment they left the parking lot behind the church. Lauren Mitchell and Andrew Caldwell left no traces indicating they continued normal living, travel, or intentional communication. This allowed the team to largely rule out the couple voluntarily leaving to start a new life without notice. Though what happened remained undetermined, the digital evidence showed the disappearance did not match typical adult behavior patterns for intentional vanishing. Within this investigation phase, that conclusion was a critical milestone, closing personal data review and providing logical groundwork for subsequent steps, as the case increasingly revealed signs unexplained by simple hypotheses. After both public data and personal digital layers showed no activity post-disappearance, the team moved to examining private physical spaces directly tied to Lauren Mitchell's and Andrew Caldwell's daily lives, to determine if the vanishing was pre-planned. The starting point was the expected post-wedding accommodation known to family. Investigators worked directly with the facility, checking registration logs, booking systems, and room status reserved for the couple. Results confirmed the room remained unused since booking, with no signs anyone checked in and left. No luggage delivered, no service requests, no evidence Lauren and Andrew ever arrived. Failing to reach the planned lodging ruled out simple delay or controllable plan change, while raising questions about where they went immediately after leaving the wedding. The search scope then expanded to other private spaces they had access to, including pre-marriage residences and frequent locations. Searches were coordinated with family to ensure full information without exceeding limits for an unresolved missing persons case. Investigators focused on elements reflecting departure preparation, luggage, documents, personal items, and essentials. In Lauren's living space, suitcases were stored neatly, with no signs of recent use. Clothes hung and folded in familiar order, no unusual gaps suggesting large quantities removed. Everyday personal items like cosmetics, toiletries, and small belongings remained in place. Similarly, Andrew's space showed no signs of long trip preparation. Closets full, shoes in place, travel items not gathered or positioned conveniently. Luggage was thoroughly checked for missing suitcases or bags. Family confirmed the couple prepared some items for post-wedding travel, but those remained at residences. No suitcases taken, no bags with clothes or personal items inexplicably gone. This directly contradicted the hypothesis of intentional long-term departure or life change, as leaving without minimal essentials defies normal behavior. Both individuals' identification documents were reviewed. Passports, personal papers, IDs, and important files were all found at residences, with no signs of removal. In many voluntary disappearances, Idaho documents are taken first for travel and future needs. All documents remaining further supported lack of pre-planning. High-value personal items, including everyday jewelry and sentimental objects, showed no signs of collection or removal. Investigators paid special attention to daily essentials, personal medications, medical items, and habit-related belongings of Lauren and Andrew remained in place. No signs of preparation for extended elsewhere living. Even small items like phone chargers, work tools, or job-related papers were undisturbed. Individually, these details might seem minor, but together they formed a consistent picture: no intentional departure preparation. During searches, investigators noted overall living space conditions. No signs of haste, no rummaged items, no rushed packing or random abandonment of valuables. Spaces reflected normal pre-wedding routine, as if Lauren and Andrew left briefly intending return. This heightened the disappearances anomaly, as prolonged silence mismatched a temporary outing without notice. Private space search results were detailed in the file, emphasizing absences over discoveries. No luggage taken, no documents removed, no essentials collected. In the weeks that followed, the file remained open, in the hope that a new detail would emerge through public reports, delayed data from some system, or unforeseen information. The family was updated periodically, though those updates became increasingly brief and confirmatory rather than providing new developments. Each exchange revolved around the same message: no new leads, no additional data, and no basis to alter the current assessment. Time passed without any significant change, and the prolonged silence gradually became an inherent part of the case. Internally, the file began to be referred to as an unexplained disappearance, a case that did not fit common patterns and refused to yield to standard investigative methods. As other priorities emerged, with new cases that were more urgent and had clearer indicators, resources allocated to this matter had to be adjusted. This did not mean the case was forgotten, but it reflected operational reality. Active investigation could not be maintained indefinitely without new data to process. After a period deemed reasonable, the file was proposed for status change. This decision was not made in a single moment, but through multiple evaluations involving commanding officers and the investigators who had directly handled the case. Each person had to confront the same question: was there any avenue that had not been seriously examined? When the answer remained no, transitioning the file to cold case status became the only remaining option. The status change process was carried out in full compliance with regulations. The file was closed at the active investigation level, but not destroyed or permanently archived. All documents, reports, and collected data from the initial investigation phase were organized, labeled, and stored to ensure future accessibility. Unresolved points were clearly noted to avoid repeating steps if the case were reopened later. The family was formally notified of the decision, with an explanation that moving to cold case status was not abandonment, but an acknowledgement that at that time, no further active investigative actions could be taken without new information. From the moment the file's status changed, the rhythm of the case shifted markedly. There were no longer regular meetings, no weekly update reports, and no dedicated personnel assigned to specific leads. The case entered a static phase, existing in the system as an unsolved matter, awaiting an external factor to break the silence. In this state, the case was not completely forgotten, but it no longer featured in the daily workflow of the investigative force. Whenever new data appeared in related systems, the file could still be cross-referenced, but no proactive efforts were made to generate such data. The absence of an established crime scene continued to be the greatest barrier. There was no place to return to, no physical space to re-examine with new methods, and no physical evidence to apply advanced analytical techniques. Everything stopped at what was known: a couple leaving a wedding, a vehicle vanishing, and a prolonged chain of silence. In internal reports, the case was described as highly complex due to the lack of input data rather than overlapping or conflicting evidence. Over time, the case of Lauren Mitchell and Andrew Caldwell gradually faded from public consciousness, as there was no new information to sustain attention. For the authorities, it became a true cold case, a file stored, ready to be reopened if new leads emerged, but no longer the subject of active investigation. This status change marked the end of the initial investigation phase, not with an explanation or conclusion, but with the recognition that every available tool and method at that time had been exhausted. The case remained unsolved, not closed in substance, but frozen in process, existing as an unanswered question in the system, awaiting a different moment when new conditions might allow it to be viewed in a different light. Many years after the file was transferred to cold case status, no changes arose from traditional investigative channels, and the matter existed as a static set of records in the archives, until a discovery completely outside the police scope altered that silence. This discovery did not come from a new witness, a confession, or an internal review of old files by authorities, but from an independent research effort using historical satellite data. While analyzing satellite images taken in 2008 for a long-term environmental project, a research team noticed a detail inconsistent with the natural characteristics of the area under study. In a sequence of images of the same terrain over time, an elongated light-colored shape beneath the water surface in a remote area appeared in images taken precisely during the period coinciding with the year Lauren Mitchell and Andrew Caldwell disappeared. This shape was absent in earlier images and did not appear in later ones after seasonal water level changes, making it a notable anomaly for those familiar with the area's terrain. The initial analysis was not aimed at identifying the object, but at confirming its appearance could not be explained by common natural factors such as exposed rock, fallen trees, or geological shifts. The team cross-referenced images from multiple dates, using supplementary data layers to rule out image noise or technical errors. Results showed the shape's size and proportions were inconsistent with natural structures in the area, and its location was in a zone with minimal strong currents, making random drift unlikely. Recognizing that the discovery exceeded their expertise, the team precisely marked the geographic coordinates of the anomaly, noted the first appearance timeframe in the image sequence, and recorded basic observable characteristics from the satellite data. The decision to notify authorities was not immediate, but followed the team's own confirmation that their finding was not an obvious mistake. The information was sent to local management agencies, along with satellite imagery data, detailed coordinates, and a brief description of why they believed the object warranted further examination. Initially, the report was handled as external information not directly tied to any specific case. However, when the location was cross-checked against archived files, a notable coincidence emerged. The marked area fell within the geographic range preliminarily considered in the Mitchell and Caldwell disappearance, though at the time there had been insufficient data for deeper focus. When this information reached the cold case unit, Lauren and Andrew's file was retrieved to compare timelines and locations. The fact that an anomalous object appeared in satellite images precisely during their disappearance period, in an area within the assumed range, but never confirmed with physical evidence, immediately elevated the discovery's seriousness. Crucially, this finding did not contradict prior conclusions, but filled a major gap that had persisted for years: the complete disappearance of the last confirmed vehicle. Though there was no direct evidence linking the imaged shape to the Range Rover, the similarity in size and shape was sufficient to warrant testing the hypothesis with other methods. The discovery, originating from a source outside the police system, gave it special weight. It was unaffected by assumptions or investigative ruts formed during the initial probe, and free from the agency's other workload pressures. This external nature led to its evaluation as a genuinely new lead, rather than a reinterpretation of old data. After basic verification, relevant agencies decided to forward the report to higher authority for assessing potential ties to an unsolved case. This process led to a significant administrative and investigative shift. The cold case file of Lauren Mitchell and Andrew Caldwell, previously in passive storage, was flagged for review. Reactivation was not loud or public. It began with internal discussions to determine if the new lead justified reallocating resources. Factors considered included the discovery source's reliability, satellite data consistency, and the marked location's alignment with prior geographic assumptions. With no clear contradictions found, approval was given for further evaluation steps. From the investigative system's perspective, this was the first time in years an element emerged that could not be immediately dismissed. Unlike vague tips or baseless speculation, the satellite imagery finding was objective and verifiable through other technical means. It offered no answers but pointed to a specific location, a map point tied to a defined time frame. That specificity broke the file's frozen state, turning what seemed a stalled case into one with potential renewed progress. Reactivating the case did not mean old questions were instantly answered, but it marked the end of the years-long static period. The file was no longer merely archived documents, but an object needing re-evaluation in light of a new externally sourced lead, unburdened by prior constraints. In this phase, the satellite discovery was not treated as evidence, but as a signal strong enough to compel system response. It served as a reminder that truth, though buried by time and data absence, can sometimes resurface from unexpected sources, and that moment pulled the case of Lauren Mitchell and Andrew Caldwell out of its frozen state into an entirely different phase from the years before. After the satellite imagery lead was forwarded to authorities, and the cold case file returned to review status, the decisive next step was on-site verification at the marked location. The area was a lake isolated from main routes, surrounded by largely undisturbed natural terrain, not a tourist spot or regular local activity site. The survey was planned carefully, with the initial goal not to reach conclusions, but to confirm whether the satellite anomaly existed in reality. The survey team accessed the area using terrain-appropriate vehicles, recording weather conditions, water levels and shore accessibility from multiple directions. The lake had varying depths, with some deeper zones far from shore matching the satellite-indicated anomaly location. Initial visual observations yielded no clear information, The water surface was calm, showing no surface signs of a large submerged object. This did not diminish the lead's value, but aligned with the assumption that a long submerged object would leave no easily visible external traces. To move from suspicion to physical confirmation, the team deployed sonar equipment for systematic lake bottom scanning. Sonar allowed generation of reflection images from underwater objects, distinguishing natural structures from man-made ones. Scan lines were set based on satellite coordinates, extending outward to cover related areas. The scanning proceeded slowly, with data recorded and analyzed in real time. Initially, reflections showed uneven lake bottom terrain with mud, rocks and underwater vegetation producing familiar patterns. However, as the equipment neared the target zone, a distinct signal emerged. The reflection image revealed a mass with relatively clear outlines, size and shape inconsistent with typical natural structures. The mass lay at sufficient depth to avoid surface influences, and its position closely matched the satellite-marked coordinates. Sonar data was collected multiple times from different angles to rule out noise or technical error. Each scan yielded similar results, reinforcing that this was not random. The object's geometric features, including relatively straight edges and specific length-to-width ratios, led the team to assess it as very likely man-made. Though sonar did not provide detail sufficient for precise identification, it distinguished an unusual rock formation from a human-origin structure. At this point, the suspicion had crossed from pure conjecture into preliminary technical confirmation. After confirming a man-made object on the lake bottom, the next question concerned its context. The team considered natural explanations for its presence, including drift from elsewhere or abandonment during past construction. However, the lake area lacked history of large-scale industrial or construction activity, and the object's location was hard to access from shore, making accidental placement unlikely. Additionally, the shape appearing in satellite images only from a specific time frame coinciding with the disappearance year heightened relevance. In this context, the team evaluated the possibility the object was intentionally submerged. Factors included depth, distance from shore, and vehicle access feasibility. Placing a large object at this lake bottom spot would require preparation and knowledge of terrain and water conditions. This made intentional disposal more plausible than other scenarios. However, at this stage, the team remained cautious, avoiding conclusions without direct evidence. Their role was confirmation and assessment, not motive speculation. Once sonar data and field observations were compiled, a preliminary report was prepared and forwarded to relevant agencies. The report emphasized 3 key points: the existence of a man-made object on the lake bottom, positional and temporal alignment with the satellite lid, and the lack of clear natural explanation for its presence. These were sufficient to justify advancing to the next verification phase, but not to draw specific ties to the disappearance. Maintaining this boundary was essential for investigative objectivity. Before leaving the site, the team took necessary preparations for potential future recovery. This included precisely marking the object's position with positioning devices, recording depth and bottom conditions, and assessing risks for heavy equipment or divers. Environmental factors like water turbidity and ecosystem impact were noted to ensure future operations complied with regulations. At the survey phase's conclusion, the case status had markedly changed from reactivation. Previously, the lead existed only as a satellite data anomaly. Now technical means confirmed a real man-made object on the lake bottom. This shift marked a critical boundary between suspicion and confirmation, hypothesis and verifiable reality. Though no conclusions yet existed on the object's nature or origin, confirming its presence created a solid foundation for next steps. Within this phase, the survey team fulfilled its mission, turning a question mark on satellite imagery into a specific real-world point where a man-made object rested quietly on the lake bottom, awaiting clarification. After the man-made object at the bottom of the lake was confirmed by sonar and its position precisely marked, the decision to salvage it was made with the goal of recovering the largest possible physical evidence related to the disappearance of Lauren Mitchell and Andrew Caldwell. The salvage planning was carried out cautiously, as this was a complex operation requiring coordination among multiple units while ensuring both safety and the integrity of the evidence. The technical team surveyed the lake bottom conditions, depth, water turbidity, and accessibility using specialized lifting equipment. Salvage options were considered based on the estimated size of the object, its location far from the shore, and the risk of disturbing sediment that could affect the recording of traces. The final plan prioritized securing the object before lifting it, to minimize uncontrolled movement during the pull. The salvage timing was chosen based on stable weather conditions, ensuring visibility and safety for the participating personnel. Prior to deployment, the surrounding area was cordoned off to restrict unnecessary access, while the initial scene conditions were documented for future comparison. When the salvage process began, the lifting equipment was positioned according to the marked coordinates. Divers conducted a direct inspection to confirm the object's shape and orientation before attaching the tow cables. Beneath layers of mud and sediment accumulated over many years, the object emerged with outlines consistent with a motorized vehicle, confirming what the sonar data had suggested. The securing process was done slowly to avoid flaking or damaging the remaining structure. Once the ready signal was confirmed, the process of pulling the vehicle up from the lake bottom commenced. The lifting force was adjusted gradually, allowing water and mud to drain out as the object left the bottom. As the vehicle neared the surface, the shape of an SUV gradually became clear, with the mud covering the body sliding off, revealing a silver paint job corroded over time. Bringing the vehicle to shore was completed after many hours, under close supervision to ensure no fragments or items that might fall out during the salvage were missed. As soon as the vehicle was brought to a stable surface, documentation of the vehicle's condition began. Investigators and forensic technicians observed the overall state, noting the degree of corrosion, the condition of the body, chassis, and any visible damage detectable by the naked eye. Water and sediment had destroyed most perishable details, the windows were no longer intact, and the interior had been severely affected after years submerged. However, the overall structure was sufficient to clearly identify the vehicle type, size, and style. No major collision signs were noted immediately. There was no obvious deformation indicating a high-speed impact, though accurate assessment required more thorough examination in a controlled environment. The chassis number and identifying features were checked as much as possible to cross-reference with previously stored vehicle registration records. The match in characteristics confirmed that the salvaged vehicle was indeed the Range Rover that had left the wedding on the night of the disappearance. During the initial inspection, a key factor noted was the absence of human remains in the vehicle's compartments. The seats, trunk, and all accessible areas were carefully checked, but there were no signs of bodies or human remnants. The lack of remains did not diminish the value of the discovery, but it raised a new question about what had happened to Lauren and Andrew after the vehicle was placed in the lake. At this point, the investigation team made no public hypotheses. They simply noted the fact that the vehicle existed separately from the victims, at least at the time of salvage. In parallel with the overall inspection, physical evidence collection was conducted under strict procedures. Any remaining items in the vehicle, even if heavily damaged, were documented and seized. Each item was numbered, photographed, and sealed for later analysis. Sediment, water samples, and material fragments adhering to the vehicle were also collected to assist in determining the duration and conditions of submersion. Small details, such as the position of intact components or signs of tampering with the vehicle's structure, were carefully noted, as they could provide important information about how the vehicle was placed in the lake. All steps were taken with the awareness that this was the largest and most significant physical evidence recovered since the case began. Once on-site documentation was complete, the vehicle was transferred to a suitable facility for further examination under controlled conditions. The transfer was done carefully to avoid losing any remaining traces. Before leaving the lake area, the investigation team conducted a final sweep to ensure no fragments or evidence were left behind. The salvage area was redocumented in its post-operation state for future reference if needed. The conclusion of the salvage phase marked a clear physical advancement in the case compared to previous stages. The Range Rover, which had vanished from all monitoring systems and left no trace for many years, had now been recovered and confirmed. Though no remains were found, the vehicle's long-term presence at the lake bottom provided an undeniable fact. The car had been removed from normal living spaces and placed in an isolated environment where it could not be discovered accidentally. Recovering the vehicle did not provide complete answers, but it shifted the case's focus from hypotheses to concrete evidence, from an inexplicable absence to a tangible object that could be analyzed. Within the scope of this phase, the vehicle salvage fulfilled its role, bringing a major piece once out of reach of the investigation back to the surface and placing it at the center of the search for truth. After the Range Rover was salvaged and transferred to a controlled examination facility, the case's focus shifted entirely to the evidence analysis phase, with the goal of clarifying what the vehicle could reveal about the circumstances and nature of the disappearance. The work began with seizing and cataloging all remaining items in the vehicle, whether intact or destroyed by time and the water environment. The interior, severely eroded, still contained some personal items and structural details sufficient for documentation. Each item was treated as an independent unit, photographed in place, numbered and sealed before detailed analysis. The seizure aimed not to find a single decisive clue, but to build a comprehensive picture of what had been present in the vehicle when it was placed in the lake. Among the collected items, a few stood out due to their clear identifiability, while many others served only to support reconstructing the context. The next step was identifying the origin of the seized evidence. Identifiable items were cross-referenced with information from the families and personal records of Lauren Mitchell and Andrew Caldwell to confirm ownership, usage context and consistency with the time of disappearance. This process showed that most items in the vehicle fit the context of a couple who had just left a wedding, no signs of preparation for a long trip, no unexplained unusual items. However, alongside consistent details, some evidence did not easily fit a normal daily context. Certain valuable or highly personal items appeared in the vehicle in a way that was not entirely random, prompting investigators to question why they remained after many years. Identifying the origin of each item aimed not only to confirm ownership, but also to understand whether their presence resulted from daily habits or intentional action. In parallel with origin identification, the discovery location of each item within the vehicle was analyzed thoroughly. Investigators noted whether items were in the driver's compartment, back seats, trunk, or less used areas, as each position could suggest different behaviors or states when the vehicle was submerged. The relatively stable distribution of items, with no signs of major disturbance, indicated the interior had not experienced a clear violent event before flooding. There was no evidence of items being scattered by a strong impact or hastily gathered. This aligned with initial observations of no major body deformation, but raised questions about the motive and method of submerging the vehicle while maintaining a relatively intact interior state. A key factor in this phase was evaluating the possibility that items were left in the vehicle intentionally. Investigators considered whether the Range Rover was not simply abandoned randomly, but placed in the lake as an act of concealment or misdirection. In that context, the presence of highly identifiable items, if placed back in the vehicle after use elsewhere, could mean something different from being forgotten. This evaluation was based not on a single item, but on the combination of position, condition, and relationships among collected items. Details that might mean little alone, when viewed together, suggested the vehicle may have been handled in a specific sequence rather than as a random event. Evidence analysis also included comparing the item's condition to the environment the vehicle had been in for years. Degrees of corrosion, sediment distribution, and biological traces on surfaces were examined to determine if there were signs of movement or intervention after submersion. Initial results showed continuous, largely uninterrupted submersion, reinforcing that the vehicle had remained in place for a long time without disturbance. This reduced the likelihood of multiple movements or temporary placement, and supported viewing it as a location chosen for long-term concealment. Once the analysis layers were complete, investigators synthesized results to reassess the case's nature. Before the Range Rover was found, the disappearance of Lauren Mitchell and Andrew Caldwell existed in an unclear state, with accident, voluntary departure, or criminal act all uneliminable. However, the vehicle's discovery at the lake bottom, along with collected evidence characteristics, significantly changed that view. The vehicle showed no signs of a typical traffic accident, and its location in a hard-to-access spot with no traces in monitoring systems suggested calculated action. The items inside, rather than clarifying an unexpected accident, reinforced the sense that the vehicle was removed from normal spaces with specific intent. This shift was clearly reflected in internal analysis reports. The case was no longer primarily viewed as an unexplained disappearance, but began to be evaluated as an event potentially involving intentional concealment. Importantly, at this stage, analysis focused entirely on physical evidence and context, not on identifying individuals or assigning specific responsibility. Maintaining this boundary ensured conclusions were based on existing evidence, not influenced by speculation about motives or perpetrators. At the end of the evidence analysis phase, the investigation team noted that the case's evaluation nature had changed. From a long-term missing persons file with little data, it now had a clear physical center and a set of concrete evidence for further exploitation. The Range Rover was not just the last seen vehicle, but became a key element reshaping the entire case. Within this phase's scope, evidence analysis did not provide final answers, but closed an important stage, one where the case shifted from ambiguity to structure, where findings forced the investigation system to view the disappearance of Lauren Mitchell and Andrew Caldwell in a different, more serious light, no longer explainable by simple hypotheses as before. The recovery of the Range Rover and accompanying evidence analysis created a clear breaking point in how the case was viewed, forcing the investigation system into a new phase with a completely different structure and priorities. The first decision was to establish a new investigation team, not merely continuing the old one, but a reorganized unit with clearer tasks and authority. The team included investigators experienced in complex long-term cases, along with specialists in record and physical evidence analysis. The personnel change did not imply negating prior efforts, but aimed to create a fresh perspective unbound by assumptions formed in the initial phase. As soon as the new team was formed, the entire disappearance file was reassembled, from the first missing persons reports to documents related to the salvage and vehicle analysis. The goal of this review was not to find randomly overlooked clues, but to reevaluate the entire investigation process in light of physically confirmed findings. The review of old files was conducted systematically, chronologically, and by separate data groups. Key early decisions were re-examined, including initial geographic scoping, risk assessment, and prioritized hypotheses. New investigators questioned assumptions once reasonable at the time, but potentially mismatched with new discoveries. The failure to find the vehicle in prior years was reconsidered. No longer just a tracing failure but a meaningful data point. The car had been placed in a position isolated enough to evade normal monitoring. Public data reports, personal data, and private spaces were reread to identify any details, even small ones, previously undervalued or misprioritized. This review aimed not to criticize or assign blame, but to understand how context and technological limits at the time shaped decisions. In the reanalysis, some initial errors were identified, not as serious mistakes, but systemic blind spots. For example, over-focus on main roads and easily monitored public infrastructure, while more isolated areas were considered only hypothetically, was now seen as an early limitation. Similarly, lacking a physical anchor made hypotheses compete equally without strength to eliminate others. These errors were noted as lessons, not to change the past, but to shape a new approach, fitting the reality that the case was no longer a vague disappearance, but had evidence of intentional concealment. From these assessments, the investigation strategy was clearly redirected. Instead of continuing to seek signs of voluntary departure or random accident for Lauren Mitchell and Andrew Caldwell, focus shifted to understanding how and in what context the Range Rover was placed in the lake. This required a different approach, centered on action sequence, site access, and preparation level needed for such an act. The new strategy did not seek immediate answers to who, but clarified how and under what circumstances, as these could be answered by reanalyzing existing data and collecting related physical evidence. Redirecting also involved clearly distinguishing verifiable hypotheses from baseless speculation to avoid repeating resource spread. In parallel with strategy restructuring, the case level was officially upgraded in the system. From a cold case missing persons file, it was reclassified with higher severity, reflecting potential criminal activity. This upgrade was not just administrative, but opened access to different resources and tools suited to the case's new nature. Internal procedures were adjusted to ensure new information received higher priority. This also allowed the new team to access previously unmobilized departments and expertise within legal bounds. Throughout restructuring, one principle was maintained: no premature conclusions without strong supporting evidence. The vehicle's lake bottom discovery and initial evidence signs of concealment did not automatically lead to a specific scenario, but only established the case no longer fit simple hypotheses. Investigators were required to separate proven facts from possibilities. This was especially important in a years-long case where pressure for answers could lead to unfounded assignments. The new team was formed with clear awareness that their task was rebuilding the case from evidence foundations, not perceptions or expectations. Investigation restructuring also brought changes in information management. Files were reorganized to reflect the new logical sequence, with timelines and data arranged by relevance to physical findings. Old hypotheses were not fully discarded, but placed in new context for re-evaluation based on collected evidence. Previous reports were supplemented with notes highlighting points for reconsideration or unresolved questions. This process turned a thick but fragmented file into a more orderly structure, suited for deeper continued investigation. As the restructuring phase ended, the case of Lauren Mitchell and Andrew Caldwell had fundamentally changed state. It was no longer a passive file awaiting new information, but a reshaped case with clearer strategy and goals. Establishing the new team, fully reviewing old files, identifying initial limitations, redirecting approach, and upgrading case level created a new starting point, distinct from early years post-disappearance. Within this phase's scope, no suspects were identified, no final conclusions made, but one thing was firmly established: the case had been truly reset, with a strong enough physical evidence foundation to justify continued serious, systematic investigation. After the case was restructured and the investigation strategy reoriented, the next focus shifted to a layer of information previously considered secondary: the personal relationships surrounding Lauren Mitchell and Andrew Caldwell. This examination was not aimed at seeking emotions or psychological motives, but at determining whether in the private lives of the two individuals there existed elements that had not been properly prioritized in the initial phase. The work began with reviewing the personal belongings collected from Lauren and Andrew's residences, as well as items kept by the family over the years. Each item was examined not merely as personal property, but as a data point reflecting relationships, habits, and social interactions prior to the disappearance. Familiar items were quickly categorized and eliminated, but in the process, investigators began to notice certain details that did not entirely fit the previously constructed picture. A few items were not on the list of everyday belongings, were not associated with the couple's daily life, and were not immediately recognized by the family, prompting the investigation team to retain them for further scrutiny. The discovery of unusual items did not occur suddenly, but through a meticulous cross-checking process. These objects did not bear direct signs of criminal activity, but their presence raised questions about origin and context. Investigators checked whether they had been gifted, purchased, or exchanged in a specific circumstance. In this process, a strange name emerged through a small piece of information attached to one of those items. This name was not on the list of close friends, did not appear in family relationships, and was not mentioned in the initial statements of those around them. The appearance of an unfamiliar name, even through an indirect detail, was immediately flagged as a factor needing clarification, as it represented a connection that had not previously been seriously considered. The investigation team cross-referenced this name with existing information, including the wedding guest list, work relationships, and social circles that Lauren and Andrew had interacted with in the time before the disappearance. Initial results showed that the name was not in the inner circle, but neither was it completely unfamiliar in an absolute sense. It appeared sporadically in some indirect contexts, enough to prove that this was not a random coincidence. The fact that the name had not been mentioned before did not necessarily mean it was deliberately concealed, but it indicated that the previous scope of investigation may have overlooked connections outside the most obvious circles. The process of checking personal relationships continued by expanding the cross-referencing of Lauren and Andrew's social circles, not only based on statements, but also on available administrative and social data. Investigators analyzed connections in layers: family, close friends, colleagues, extended social relationships, and situational contacts. Each layer was examined with the same question: whether anyone in these groups had a presence in the couple's life that had not previously been given the appropriate level of importance. In this process, clear relationships that had been thoroughly checked from the initial phase were quickly eliminated, while fainter connections began to receive more attention, precisely because their faintness made them easy to overlook. The cross-referencing of circles also included examining indirect interactions, where Lauren or Andrew might have come into contact with someone through a third party. Such connections often leave no clear trace in traditional records, but could be reflected through personal items, daily schedules, or small changes in habits. Investigators were not seeking evidence of conflict or open disagreement, but rather unexplained points of intersection. In that context, the strange name that had appeared earlier began to be placed in a broader picture, where it was no longer an isolated detail, but a potential node connecting multiple layers of information. As the relationships were overlaid, a new assessment gradually formed. The disappearance of Lauren and Andrew was no longer viewed solely within the scope of the two individuals and their closest relationships. Instead, it was placed within a broader social network, where unclear connections could play a more important role than previously assumed. The appearance of a strange name through personal belongings indicated at least one relationship that the couple had not fully shared with those around them, or simply one that no one had noticed at the time. The investigation team noted that establishing a new suspicion did not mean determining responsibility or motive. At this stage, suspicion was merely an acknowledgement that there were individuals or relationships that had not been fully included in the scope of investigation. Establishing new suspicion was based on the principle of caution. No one was considered a suspect, but neither was anyone eliminated, simply because they were not in the close circle. Connections were reclassified by potential relevance, with the strange name added to the list for continued verification. The process of checking personal relationships concluded with a significant shift in how the case was viewed. Previously, the incident had been primarily examined through physical elements and objective data. Now it began to be placed in the context of human relationships, where small details could carry great significance. The discovery of unusual items, the appearance of a name not in known circles, and the recross-referencing of Lauren and Andrew's entire social network opened a new line of suspicion, not based on speculation, but on specific recorded data. Within the framework of this work, the investigation team did not pursue searches or interrogations, but only established that the case had an additional layer of information needing clarification. The emergence of new suspicion did not provide an answer, but it broke the stasis of old assumptions, laying the foundation for the next phase of investigation, where personal relationships were no longer a faint background, but became a central part of the search for truth. After a new suspicion was established from the process of checking personal relationships, the investigation team moved to the phase of tracing identity, with the goal of clarifying the nature of the strange name that had appeared, not through speculation or direct contact, but through administrative verification methods and structured data. The work began with systematic searches in existing databases, including population records, driver's licenses, residency registrations, and other public information storage systems. The search was not aimed at finding a single result, but at determining whether the name consistently existed in the systems and if so, in what contexts it appeared. Initial results showed that the name was not fictitious. It was linked to an individual with valid administrative records, who had lived and worked in the same geographic area as Lauren Mitchell and Andrew Caldwell prior to their disappearance. Confirming this existence was the crucial first step, as it shifted the suspicion from abstract to a verifiable entity through data. After the basic identity was confirmed, the investigation team continued to check employment records related to this individual. Sources of information included tax records, employment data, and other administrative documents used to reconstruct work history and professional connections. The goal was not to evaluate personal behavior, but to determine whether this individual had any intersection with Lauren and Andrew's lives through the work environment. The review results revealed notable overlaps in time and space. The individual had worked for a unit with indirect connections to activities or assets related to Andrew's family, though not in a prominent or public position. These connections were not sufficient to conclude anything, but they showed that the appearance of the strange name was not entirely random, but lay within a broader existing network of relations. The discovery of internal connections became the next focus of this phase. The investigation team analyzed whether the individual being verified had any links to persons or organizations that had appeared in the case file, even indirectly. Data cross-referenced included work history, short-term contracts, and administrative interactions that may not have been noticed in the initial investigation phase. Through this process, some overlapping connections were identified, not as direct evidence, but as potential links between layers of information previously considered separately. These internal connections were not public, and thus they may have fallen outside the scope of attention in prior investigation steps. As the data was compiled, the investigation team proceeded to identify the specific subject within the new suspicion framework. This identification did not imply accusation, but aimed to narrow down an individual with sufficient factors to warrant closer examination in the investigation process. Criteria used included valid presence in the area at the relevant time, verifiable administrative or professional connections, and indirect appearance in physical evidence or analyzed personal data. When these criteria were cross-checked, a specific subject was identified as the focus of suspicion, not due to direct evidence, but due to the convergence of many small factors, each individually unremarkable, but combined forming a pattern needing monitoring. The decision to open a monitoring file for this subject was made within a strict legal framework, with clearly limited scope. The monitoring file did not include contact, interrogation, or field surveillance, but focused on collecting and updating administrative data, history, and verifiable connections through legal sources. Opening the monitoring file reflected a significant shift in the case from searching for abstract clues to focusing on a specific identity, while maintaining principles of caution and objectivity. The investigation team noted that identity verification at this stage was not aimed at seeking confession or direct evidence, but at ensuring all information related to the subject was collected and evaluated systematically, avoiding oversight of details that could become important later. Throughout the identity tracing process, A principle was upheld: complete separation between data and speculation. Investigators did not make judgments about motive or role of the subject, as those questions were beyond this phase's scope. Instead, they focused on building the most accurate and complete data profile possible based on objective sources. This was particularly important in a case spanning many years, where pressure to find a central figure could lead to unsubstantiated attribution. Identity tracing was seen as a necessary step to ensure that, if the case continued to progress, it would be based on a solid information foundation, not vague assumptions. At the end of the identity tracing phase, the case of Lauren Mitchell and Andrew Caldwell reached a new structural state. From having only general hypotheses about what might have happened, the case now had a specific subject identified within the suspicion scope, with a set of verified administrative and professional data. Opening the monitoring file did not affirm any conclusion, but it marked the shift from asking whether anyone was involved to who needs to be considered next. Within this work's framework, the investigation team did not take any actions beyond verifying identity and connections, but that clarity laid the foundation for the case's next steps, where identity was no longer a faint name, but a specific entity in the investigation system, ready for deeper evaluation when sufficient grounds exist. After the suspected subject's identity was verified at the administrative level, and an official monitoring file was opened, the case entered the controlled monitoring phase, with the goal of proving behavior through observation and cross-referencing, rather than invasive or search measures. The guiding principle of this phase was collecting objective data on the subject's movements and observable activities in public spaces, while correlating that data with established timelines in the case file. Monitoring was not conducted continuously or overtly, but in planned intervals, to minimize detection risk and ensure all collected information remained within legal bounds. Investigators focused on recording frequently used routes, movement times and locations the subject tended to visit, not to speculate on motive, but to build a behavior map based on observed reality. In this process, some patterns began to emerge, not clear enough for immediate conclusions, but consistent enough to warrant recording and further monitoring. As movement data accumulated, a significant discovery emerged through cross-referencing the vehicles the subject used in daily life. One of these vehicles, though not frequently used, had characteristics matching a vehicle recorded in the case file from years earlier, but untraceable at that time. The discovery of this once missing vehicle did not happen suddenly, but through meticulous comparison of current records and old data. Investigators did not rush to conclusions, but rechecked registration records, usage history, and changes related to the vehicle over the long period. Results showed the vehicle had disappeared from normal monitoring channels during the phase, when the case stalled, and only reappeared in administrative data later with a different context. This match was not enough to prove criminal behavior, but it created a specific bridge between the present and the case's past. Timeline cross-referencing became the next decisive step. Investigators placed the subject's current movement data on the same timeline as key case milestones, including the disappearance time, when the victim's vehicle vanished from all monitoring systems, and when the object was discovered at the lake bottom. The goal was not to seek random coincidences, but to determine if there were time periods where the subject's absence or presence could be contextualized with known events. Through this process, notable gaps were identified, where data on the subject became faint or incomplete, coinciding with critical case phases. These gaps were not automatically considered evidence, but recorded as points needing explanation if the case progressed further. Parallel to timeline cross-referencing, the investigation team linked behavior by examining consistency between observed activities and possible actions identified in the new investigation strategy. For example, routes the subject frequently used were compared to possible routes leading to the lake area where the victim's vehicle was found. Movement habits in certain time frames were placed against assumptions about time needed for intentional concealment. Each link was evaluated cautiously, with awareness that geographic or temporal coincidence, without other support, could be random. However, when multiple small factors pointed in one direction, they began forming an analyzable behavior structure. Throughout the monitoring phase, investigators paid special attention to not crossing permitted boundaries. There was no intrusion into private spaces, no collection of personal data beyond legal scope, and no direct approach to the subject. All information was gathered through public space observation and legally accessible administrative data. This approach not only ensured investigation legality, but also protected the value of collected data, avoiding risks of exclusion or later dispute. As data continued to accumulate, the investigation team began strengthening suspicion by assessing overall fit between observed behavior and the restructured case scenario. The discovery of the once missing vehicle, matching time gaps, and consistency in travel routes were not considered in isolation, but as pieces of a larger picture. No single piece was strong enough to stand alone, but together they formed a logical structure sufficient to justify continued heightened attention to the subject. Importantly, at this phase, suspicion was no longer based on feeling or speculation, but on systematically verified and recorded data. The controlled monitoring process also allowed the investigation team to check internal consistency of constructed hypotheses. If the subject was truly involved in concealing the vehicle, their current behaviors needed to align, at least basically, with the ability and opportunity to perform such actions in the past. This comparison was not to prove guilt, but to eliminate unfit scenarios. Over time, some initial hypotheses were discarded due to mismatch with observed data, while others were retained and strengthened. At the end of the controlled monitoring phase, the case reached a new state in terms of proving behavior. The investigation team did not have direct evidence or a confession, but they had built a consistent chain of behavioral data, connecting the suspected subject to key timelines and physical elements of the case. Strengthening suspicion at this phase did not lead to immediate action, but created a solid foundation for evaluating next steps. Within this works framework, monitoring was not to conclude the case, but to establish that suspicion had moved beyond speculation into the realm verifiable by observed behavior. That shift marked the completion of the controlled monitoring phase, where all collected data served one goal: proving that what was suspected existed not just on paper, but had clear reflection in real behavior. When the controlled surveillance phase concluded with the consolidation of suspicions at the level of individual behavior, the investigation team began to realize that what was emerging could no longer be fully explained by the isolated actions of a single person. The new focus of the investigation shifted to identifying a broader concealment structure, starting with initial indicators related to a storage unit that the suspect had indirect access to. This storage unit was not discovered through searches or coercive measures, but through cross-referencing administrative data, rental records, and publicly available activity logs related to storage properties in the area. Investigators noted that the location had existed for a long time, with a declared purpose that appeared neutral, but accompanying data revealed a usage pattern inconsistent with normal functions. The fact that the storage unit maintained stable operational status over many years, with small but regular changes in personnel access and vehicles used, made it a notable point in the emerging picture. Long-term activity monitoring at this location was conducted through lawful sources, including rental records, maintenance data, utility usage history, and related service logs. There were no signs of intermittent use or abandonment. On the contrary, the data showed consistent maintenance, despite no clear public business activity. This consistency was particularly noteworthy when compared to the suspect's lack of personal storage needs on that scale, at least according to verifiable financial and lifestyle records. This led to the assumption that the storage unit might serve a different purpose, not clearly reflected in official documents. However, at this stage, the investigation team maintained a cautious approach, treating it as a factor to be correlated with other data rather than standalone evidence. When the storage unit data was placed alongside information gathered during the prior surveillance phase, a more complex pattern began to emerge. Investigators realized that access to and maintenance of the storage unit was not the action of a single individual. Administrative records and public data showed the involvement of multiple individuals at different times, each playing a specific role, but none appearing as the sole responsible party. Some related individuals had indirect professional or social connections to the suspect, while others appeared only in technical or administrative support roles. This dispersal of roles complicated the assignment of responsibility, but also suggested that the activity related to the storage unit was not random, but sustained through an organized network of relationships. Linking multiple individuals within the same concealment structure was done not by speculating on motives, but by cross-referencing timelines, functions, and levels of involvement for each person. Investigators constructed a relationship diagram, placing each individual according to their administrative or operational role, from contract signing and maintenance to access management. The diagram showed that no single person controlled the entire chain of activity, yet collectively, the behaviors formed a closed system sufficient to maintain concealment over a long period without drawing attention. This was a key distinction from lone concealment scenarios, where actions are often impulsive and more likely to leave traces. As this structure became clearer, the investigation team began identifying characteristics of an organized concealment mechanism. First, activities were distributed across multiple individuals and functional layers, minimizing the chance that any one person held complete information. Second, operations were wrapped in lawful transactions and procedures, allowing them to blend into normal economic and administrative activities. Third, the structure was maintained over a long period without major adjustments, indicating it was designed with enough flexibility to adapt to minor personnel or contextual changes. These features do not appear in random concealments, but are typically associated with calculated, pre-planned behavior. Identifying an organized concealment structure marked a significant turning point in the case, shifting from focusing on an individual suspect to examining a system of behavior. This required the investigation team to adjust their approach, as methods suitable for isolated actions were no longer sufficient for a more complex structure. Investigators began asking questions about each individual's level of knowledge and involvement in the network, as well as the coordination mechanisms that sustained concealment over many years. However, these questions were noted as objectives for further investigation, rather than answered at this stage. Before proceeding with any deeper intervention, the investigation team focused on preparing appropriate legal measures. This preparation did not mean immediate execution of coercive actions, but ensured that when the case moved to the next phase, every step would have solid legal grounding. Analytical reports were compiled, emphasizing the existence of the concealment structure, verified connections, and points needing further clarification. Each finding was tied to specific data, avoiding conclusions beyond what the evidence allowed. This was especially important in a case that had spanned many years and was under strict legal oversight. Preparing legal measures also involved defining the scope and objectives of subsequent steps, ensuring all actions aimed to illuminate the identified concealment structure rather than expanding the investigation broadly. The team determined that shifting from individual to systemic was not just a change in scale, but in the nature of the case. The matter could no longer be understood simply as the result of a bad decision or impulsive act, but as the product of a sustained and protected chain of behavior over time. At the end of the concealment structure identification phase, the case reached a new threshold of complexity and severity. What began as an individual suspicion was now placed within the context of an organized system involving multiple participants at varying levels. The discovery of the storage unit, long-term activity records, linking of multiple individuals, and identification of organized concealment characteristics completely changed the perception of the case. Within this phase, the investigation team conducted no coercive actions, but they completed a critical step, establishing that to continue uncovering the truth, the case needed to be handled as a systemic structure, where each action and connection could play a role in maintaining years of silence. This recognition laid the groundwork for subsequent legal steps, where the question was no longer whether concealment occurred, but how that structure would be dismantled. After the organized concealment structure was identified at the data and administrative level, the investigation team moved into the field surveillance phase, aiming to shift focus from an abstract system to specific physical spaces. Unlike the prior controlled surveillance, this activity was conducted outside residential areas, targeting low-traffic zones where actions could occur unnoticed. Surveillance was designed to minimize presence, no intervention, no contact, only recording activities in public spaces or areas without high privacy protection. Investigators were assigned shifts to ensure observation patterns were not easily detectable and did not create unnecessary pressure on subjects. The focus of this phase was not individual persons but interactions between individuals and specific geographic locations, especially those outside normal daily routines. During surveillance outside residential areas, certain behaviors began to draw the team's attention. These were not overt or publicly unusual actions, but small, repeated, purposeful movements. Investigators recorded instances where the subject or related individuals traveled to remote areas, stopped briefly, looked around, then left without clear activities such as production, transport, or recreation. Taken in isolation, these behaviors could be explained in many ways, but placed within the context of the identified concealment structure, they took on different meaning. Particularly noteworthy were directional behaviors, such as stopping at specific points, altering routes to approach the same area from different directions, or returning to a location after long intervals without obvious daily life reasons. These were not immediately interpreted, but recorded, cross-referenced, and accumulated to identify consistency. Once sufficient field surveillance data was gathered, the team proceeded to narrow down suspect areas. Narrowing was not based on a single behavior, but on the overlap of multiple recordings, individuals, and movement routes. Areas placed on the suspect list shared common traits: remote from dense residential zones, low natural oversight, accessible by vehicle, and lacking regular public activity. Investigators used topographic maps, land use data, and administrative records to assess each area's feasibility in the case context. The goal was not immediate reduction to one point, but gradual elimination of unsuitable areas, retaining those with highest potential relevance for continued observation. In parallel with narrowing, on-site data collection was conducted cautiously. Investigators did not enter or physically interfere with suspect areas, but focused on externally observable elements: ground condition, signs of terrain alteration, presence of man-made objects inconsistent with the surroundings, and evidence of human impact over time. These data were gathered lawfully through direct observation, imaging from public spaces, and comparison with existing geographic records. Over time, some areas showed unnatural changes, such as localized soil disturbance unrelated to legal agriculture or construction, or temporary access paths not regularly maintained. These signs were insufficient for conclusions, but increased attention to those areas. Throughout surveillance, the team emphasized linking field data to previously recorded behaviors. Timestamps of subject or related individual appearances near suspect areas were cross-referenced with observed on-site changes. Timing overlaps, though not perfect, created an increasingly clear chain between behavior and space. Investigators sought not perfect coincidence, but overall reasonableness, whether these behaviors aligned with accessing, checking, or maintaining a long-term concealment site. When multiple factors converged, suspect areas gained higher confidence. When field surveillance reached the point where data could no longer be expanded through observation alone, the team began preparing for a critical legal transition. Requesting search warrants was not treated as default, but as the result of accumulated evidence sufficient to justify deeper intervention. Investigators compiled all field surveillance data, movement maps, directional behavior records, area narrowing analysis, and on-site signs. Each element was presented within the overall case context to demonstrate that the proposed search area was not random, but the convergence of multiple independent information layers. The search warrant application was prepared with legal experts, ensuring all arguments rested on verifiable data and stayed within permitted scope. This was crucial in a multi-year, multi-person case where any procedural error could undermine the entire effort. The preparation aimed not only to obtain warrants, but to ensure that if and when searches occurred, they would be focused, efficient, and on target. At the conclusion of field surveillance, the case advanced significantly from abstract suspicion to specific physical locations. What began as administrative data and behavioral patterns was now tied to real spaces where concealment may have occurred. Surveillance outside residential areas, recording directional behaviors, narrowing suspect zones, and collecting on-site data created a logical chain sufficient to justify warrant requests. Within this phase, no coercive actions were taken, but the core objective was achieved, identifying one or more locations highly likely related to years-long concealment. From this point, the case shifted from questions of who and how to the more critical one, what was actually hidden, and where. After search warrants were approved, based on all accumulated data from field surveillance, the suspect area was sealed per procedure, marking the official shift from observation to forensic intervention. The goal of this phase was not random searching, but confirming or refuting the hypothesis that the narrowed location was used to conceal human remains. Initial work involved ground-penetrating radar, a non-invasive method allowing subsurface structure survey without disturbing the site. Equipment scanned parallel lines covering the entire pre-identified suspect area, with data processed on site to detect soil structure anomalies. During scanning, signals indicated unnatural interruptions in soil layers, distinctly different from surrounding geology. These anomalies had shapes, sizes, and depths consistent with refilled excavation pits, rather than natural features like roots or sediment. When multiple independent scans yielded similar results at the same location, the forensic team designated it for deeper verification. From radar data, a focal area was marked and moved to direct verification. Discovery of a shallow grave did not occur immediately by eye, but through careful correlation of radar data with surface conditions. Subtle changes in soil settlement, surface texture, and surrounding vegetation gained meaning in the context of subsurface data. The identified area had relatively shallow burial depth, enough to avoid accidental discovery, but not deep enough to erase long-term geological traces. This aligned with the assumption of calculated but hurried concealment, aimed at minimizing short-term detection risk. Once the suspect point reached sufficient evidentiary threshold, controlled excavation was authorized, involving forensic experts, forensic archaeologists, and investigators to ensure all operations were documented and evidence preserved. Excavation proceeded layer by layer, slowly and under strict control. Each removed soil layer was recorded for depth, composition, and condition to accurately reconstruct the burial sequence. No heavy machinery was used at this stage. Hand tools were prioritized to avoid damaging potential evidence. As initial layers were removed, differences in soil color and texture became clearer, reinforcing that the area had been dug and refilled. These signs were not conclusive, but provided geological context consistent with prior radar data. Every step was photographed, videotaped, and documented for potential later legal review and reconstruction. As excavation deepened, experts began finding signs no longer explainable by natural phenomena. Organic material fragments appeared in soil layers inconsistent with the environment, requiring the team to slow further and shift to special handling protocols. At this point, the excavation area was slightly expanded to ensure nothing related was missed. The shallow grave became evident when soil structure revealed a defined pit with unnatural edges and fill arrangement distinct from surroundings. This marked the shift from possible to on-site confirmed human remains concealment, though no conclusions were drawn yet regarding identity or cause of death. Recovery of remains was performed with maximum care. Each part was approached step by step to avoid unnecessary disturbance. Every detail was recorded for relative position, depth, and relation to surroundings. No on-site identification attempts were made. The sole task was safe, complete recovery. Remains were placed in specialized containers, sealed, and labeled per standard protocol to maintain integrity during transport. Concurrently, surrounding soil samples were taken for forensic analysis, including burial timing estimation and environmental preservation factors. Upon excavation completion, the area was final swept to ensure no evidence was overlooked. All tools and materials were checked and recorded to prevent cross-contamination. The post-excavation site was documented in final state for reporting and comparison. At this point, the existence of human remains was indisputably confirmed, marking a fundamental case turning point. The long-term disappearance was no longer an open question of voluntary departure or traceless accident, but an event with fatal outcome. Remains were immediately transferred to the forensic facility under secure protocol, with full chain of custody documentation. Forensic transfer was not for immediate answers, but to ensure subsequent analyses occurred in optimal conditions, as identity and cause of death conclusions required controlled expert evaluation. At phase end, the investigation team released no external information, as their task was physical confirmation, not legal or social interpretation of the discovery. The core function of the excavation phase was confirming homicide at the physical level, and that task was accomplished. The shallow grave's presence, remains recovery, and forensic handover completely shattered the ambiguity that had enveloped the case for years. From this moment, the matter was no longer treated as a complex missing person file but as a criminal homicide case with a confirmed scene and tangible physical evidence. The excavation phase provided no final resolution but established an irreversible truth. What occurred was not merely disappearance, but an act leading to death, intentionally concealed for years. This confirmation created the legal and investigative foundation for the case to enter a new phase, where questions shifted from whether homicide occurred to how that homicide was carried out and by whom. After the remains were transferred from the excavation site to the forensic facility, the case entered a critical phase, aimed at reinforcing the entire investigative process with verifiable scientific conclusions. The examination of the remains was conducted according to standard protocols for cases involving prolonged burial in a natural environment, with the primary focus on preserving as much of the material as possible to facilitate analysis. Forensic experts performed an overall assessment of the condition of the remains, documenting the degree of decomposition, the impact of soil and long-term biological factors. The examination was not carried out with the goal of seeking shocking details or speculative findings, but rather to establish foundational information, the number of individuals, burial posture, and any signs of trauma that might still be present on the bones or remaining soft tissue. Initial observations indicated that the remains belonged to a single individual, with biological characteristics consistent with the age and physical condition in the missing persons file, although these findings required further confirmation through more specific comparative methods. Concurrently with the structural examination of the remains, the comparison of clothing and accompanying materials was carried out meticulously. Fabric fragments, accessories, and personal items recovered from the burial site were cleaned using forensic protocols to avoid losing critical traces. Each item was documented in terms of material, style, and degree of damage, then compared against descriptions and photographs preserved in the original missing person report. The clothing comparison served not only for identification purposes, but also to determine whether the items matched the time of disappearance, and whether they showed signs of alteration or post-mortem intervention. Preliminary results revealed clear similarities between what was recovered and what had been recorded in the file, strengthening the connection between the remains and the long-standing missing person case. One of the most important tasks in the forensic phase was establishing the cause of death to the extent possible. This was particularly challenging given the prolonged environmental exposure that had eliminated many soft tissue indicators. Experts focused on analyzing bone structure for evidence of perimortem or antemortem trauma, including fractures, breaks, or deformities inconsistent with natural decomposition. Each sign was evaluated in relation to burial conditions and environmental factors to rule out post-burial damage. While not every question could be answered definitively, the analyses allowed investigators to determine that the death was inconsistent with natural causes or accidental circumstances, and bore the characteristics of a homicidal act. This determination was not based on a single indicator, but on a synthesis of forensic factors, from the condition of the remains, to the burial context and previously collected crime scene data. As the cause of death was clarified to the extent science permitted, identity confirmation proceeded in parallel through independent comparative methods. Remaining anthropological features were compared with medical records, and stored biological data to establish the degree of match. Where necessary, biological samples were taken for in-depth analysis, ensuring that conclusions about identity were not based on guesswork or sentiment. This process was conducted in close coordination between forensic experts and the investigative team to ensure all conclusions were placed within the overall context of the case. Once the comparative results were finalized, the victim's identity was confirmed with a high degree of certainty, ending a long period of uncertainty and replacing it with a verifiable scientific conclusion. Confirming the identity was not merely an act of identification, it also played a crucial role in completing the evidentiary file. From that point forward, the remains were no longer an anonymous discovery, but direct evidence tied to a specific individual, a specific missing person case, and a series of concealment actions, investigated over multiple prior phases. Forensic reports were integrated into the case file alongside material evidence analysis, behavioral data, and previously established investigative conclusions. Each conclusion was linked to its specific data source and analytical method to ensure the evidentiary file maintained integrity and could withstand future legal scrutiny. During the process of completing the evidentiary file, the investigative team paid particular attention to linking forensic conclusions with prior findings without creating contradictions. The cause of death was placed alongside previously developed hypotheses about concealment methods, burial timing, and the behavior of involved individuals. Consistency between scientific conclusions and the investigative timeline was key, as it allowed the case to be viewed as a logical sequence of events, rather than a disjointed collection of isolated discoveries. Completing the file was not about recounting a story, but about building a sufficiently robust evidentiary foundation to support subsequent legal steps. When the forensic and comparative phase concluded, the case reached a level of certainty it had never previously possessed. The years-long disappearance was now confirmed as a homicide, with the victim's identity established and the cause of death determined to the extent science allowed. The evidentiary file was no longer based on assumptions or inference, but was strengthened by forensic conclusions, material comparisons, and investigative data accumulated throughout the case reconstruction process. The function of this phase was not to close the case, but to create a solid foundation so that every subsequent action, whether legal or investigative, would be grounded in proven fact. From that moment, the case no longer existed in the gray area of doubt, but entered a new state in which forensic science played a central role in transforming what had once been buried into undeniable truth. Once the forensic and comparative files were completed, the investigative team determined that the evidentiary threshold had been met to permit the first coercive action against the individual identified as the primary suspect, marking the moment the case shifted from evidence gathering and consolidation to breaking a silence that had persisted for years. The decision to arrest was not based on a single factor, but on the synthesis of the entire chain of data that had been built: the concealed vehicle, documented behavioral patterns from surveillance, organized concealment structure, discovery of the shallow grave, and forensic conclusions confirming homicide. The arrest warrant was approved with clear scope, specifying the suspected conduct and accompanying legal basis to ensure the intervention occurred at the right time and against the correct individual. The arrest was executed according to a plan that minimized risk, avoided unnecessary confrontation, and took place at a location where the suspect had no access to vehicles or other individuals who might disrupt the proceedings. When the suspect was subdued and placed under official control, the case for the first time in years had a clear breaking point. The prolonged silence could no longer be sustained by an absence of data, but now faced direct personal accountability. The initial interrogation phase was launched immediately following the arrest, with the goal not of obtaining an immediate confession, but of recording reactions, cross-referencing information, and assessing consistency between the initial statement and the established evidentiary file. Investigators approached the process step by step, asking questions based on verified data, while avoiding disclosure of details known only to the investigation. Every response from the suspect was carefully documented, not only for content but also for manner of delivery, moments of hesitation, and points of evasion. In this phase, silence was no longer the default state, whether the suspect chose to cooperate or not. Confronting a structured chain of evidence created pressure that forced a response. Small inconsistencies began to emerge between the statement and established timelines, not enough for immediate conclusions, but sufficient to show that the narrative the suspect attempted to maintain did not fully align with investigative reality. As interrogation continued, the roles of others in the concealment structure began to surface, not through direct confession, but through attempts to explain and minimize responsibility. The suspect sought to position himself as a limited link, implying that key actions were not carried out alone, and that critical decisions lay beyond individual control. Although these statements were made in a self-protective context, they inadvertently confirmed a prior investigative assumption: the concealment was not the work of a lone individual, but the product of coordination. The revelation of accomplices did not come in the form of specific names or clear accusations, but through acknowledgement of the existence of others, discussions, and actions divided by role. Each such detail was recorded and compared against the relationship map built in earlier phases, allowing the team to assess the degree of alignment between the statement and existing data. From these initial disclosures, the list of involved individuals was expanded in a controlled manner. Expansion was not based on speculation or unverified statements, but on matches between what the suspect implied and connections already identified within the concealment structure. These individuals were placed under review, not as primary suspects but as potential links requiring evaluation of role and degree of involvement. This allowed the team to maintain focus on the main suspect while opening the possibility of clarifying the entire network, avoiding the mistake of framing the case in an overly simplistic scenario that failed to reflect the true nature of the years-long concealment. Concurrently with interrogation and expansion of the list of involved parties, efforts to strengthen the evidentiary chain were intensified to ensure every subsequent step rested on a solid legal foundation. Initial statements were compared against collected behavioral data, timelines were re-examined for points of alignment or contradiction, and forensic conclusions were placed in the specific context of what the suspect admitted or avoided. This reinforcement was not aimed at creating a complete narrative immediately, but at ensuring each link in the chain could stand independently, without total reliance on statements. This was crucial in a case marked by long-term silence and concealment, as it minimized the risk of collapse if statements changed or were withdrawn. Throughout this process, the investigative team maintained a clear boundary between gathering information and inferring motive. The function of the arrest and initial interrogation phase was not to recount the full story or assign all responsibility immediately, but to break the deadlock, forcing involved individuals to confront the reality that the concealment structure had been penetrated. The arrest of the primary suspect created a ripple effect across the network, as others realized that silence no longer guaranteed absolute safety. Although those reactions were not yet exploited in this phase, they were noted as an important factor for subsequent steps. When the arrest phase concluded, the case reached a completely different state from what had existed for years prior. Silence once sustained by lack of evidence was now shattered by a chain of data, behavior, and scientific conclusions strong enough to justify coercive action. The arrest of the primary suspect did not signify the end of the case, but it marked the point at which the matter shifted from searching for truth in darkness to direct confrontation with legal responsibility. Within the scope of this segment, the function of breaking the silence was fulfilled. No longer was there a vague void shielding the disappearance, but rather the beginning of a prosecutorial process in which every word, every silence, and every inconsistency became part of an evidentiary chain under construction. After the primary suspect was arrested, and the initial interrogation phase broke through the years-long silence, the investigative team entered the most critical climax of the entire process, identifying and exposing the mastermind behind the organized concealment effort. The work did not begin with a new name, but with a comprehensive cross-referencing of all collected statements, placing them side by side to find logical convergence points. The primary suspect's statements, though still evasive and self-protective, when compared chronologically began to reveal a consistent pattern. Key decisions did not originate from a single individual, but from a directive source higher in the structure. Investigators did not seek perfect alignment among statements, but focused on unconsciously repeated points and details mentioned differently, yet pointing in the same direction. When the statements were laid out together, critical timelines, the moment the vehicle was moved, the period the storage facility began to be used, the formation of the shallow grave, all indicated a series of directed decisions that could not be explained by spontaneous or random action. The gaps in the statements, where the primary suspect avoided or shifted responsibility, inadvertently highlighted the role of an individual who did not appear directly at the scene yet had the ability to control the entire process. Cross-referencing statements only gained meaning when placed alongside physical evidence comparison, and this was the point at which the picture became clearer. Investigators systematically aligned forensic conclusions, behavioral data, storage facility records, and vehicle history on the same analytical axis. What the statements implied was tested against established physical evidence. Burial timing matched vehicle movement milestones. The concealment structure reflected resource and personnel mobilization capability, and the existence of intermediary assets indicated preparation far beyond the primary suspect's capacity. In particular, the long-term use and maintenance of the storage facility, along with administratively disguised transactions, suggested the need for an individual with sufficient authority or influence to sustain the structure without raising suspicion. When the physical evidence was placed in that context, the mastermind's role ceased to be an abstract hypothesis and became a logical position in the chain of events where the pieces began to converge. From these comparisons, the team proceeded to establish the chain of command, a decisive step that shifted the investigation from suspicion to conclusion. The chain of command was not built from a single confession, but from the overlap of multiple data layers, who had the capacity to make decisions, who could coordinate, and who benefited from prolonged silence. Investigators analyzed power and dependency relationships within the identified network, determining who could influence others' actions without direct participation. Timelines were re-examined once more, this time with the central question: which critical decisions came first, and who had the ability to make them. Through this process, a relatively clear chain of command was established in which the primary suspect and other involved individuals were placed in execution roles, while strategic decisions from handling aftermath, concealing the vehicle, to maintaining the storage structure, all traced back to a single directive source. Establishing the chain of command was not based on motive speculation, but on verifiable capacity for action and control. Once the chain of command was completed to a sufficient evidentiary standard, investigative focus shifted to the individual identified as the mastermind. This was not a rushed step, as arresting someone in that position required a far higher degree of certainty than for the primary suspect. The team conducted a thorough review of all records related to this individual, from administrative history and professional connections to alignment with critical case timelines and decisions. The goal was not to find a single smoking gun piece of evidence, but to ensure that when action was taken, it was supported by a seamless evidentiary chain in which each link could withstand legal scrutiny. Comprehensive reports were redrafted, clearly presenting the mastermind's role in the concealment structure, the manner of direction employed, and the relationship to individuals already arrested or under investigation. The decision to arrest the mastermind was made when the team determined that further delay no longer offered investigative benefit, and that the risk of disrupting the evidentiary chain or affecting other involved individuals had reached an unacceptable threshold. The arrest warrant was approved with specific scope, focusing on acts of direction and organization of concealment rather than solely on direct scene involvement. Execution of the arrest was carried out with a high degree of control, reflecting the sensitivity and importance of the target. When the mastermind was brought under official control, the case officially reached its investigative peak. The individual behind the years-long concealment structure had been exposed, not through a single dramatic moment, but through persistent accumulation of data, analysis, and comparison. Following the mastermind's arrest, focus immediately shifted to finalizing the criminal file, to ensure the entire investigative process was transformed into a tight legal structure. Investigators systematically reorganized all evidence, from physical items, forensic conclusions, and behavioral data, to statements and the established chain of command. Each element was tied to the specific role of each individual in the case, ensuring responsibility was neither blurred nor equated. Finalizing the file was not about creating a compelling narrative, but about presenting a logical process in which every conclusion had basis, and every assumption had been tested. In particular, the mastermind's role was clarified not only at the level of issuing orders, but also in organizing and sustaining a concealment system capable of remaining undetected for years. Throughout this phase, the team maintained the consistent principle applied from the beginning, not allowing emotion, public pressure, or the desire to close the case to skew evidence evaluation. Exposing the mastermind was not viewed as the endpoint, but as the completion of the investigative phase, where every core question of who and how had been answered at a legal standard. The criminal file was finalized with the understanding that it would need to withstand rigorous challenges in the prosecution phase, and therefore every detail was reviewed with the highest degree of accuracy. When this phase concluded, the case had progressed from an unsolved disappearance, through years of being frozen, to a comprehensive investigation that led to the identification and arrest of both the perpetrator and the mastermind. The investigative peak function of this segment was fulfilled not by a sudden reversal, but by methodically peeling away each layer of concealment and each link in the structure, until no room remained for ambiguity. Exposing the mastermind marked the moment when the truth, buried both literally and figuratively, was brought fully and systematically into the light, creating a solid foundation for the case to enter the final stage of its legal and societal journey. After the mastermind was arrested and the concealment structure was dismantled to its deepest layer, the case officially entered the final investigative phase, where all activity was no longer aimed at uncovering new truth, but at fixing, systematizing, and locking in place what had already been established. The investigative team conducted a final review of the entire process, from the initial missing person report to the last coercive actions, to ensure every step was properly grounded, followed correct procedure, and supported by lawful evidence. Investigative reports were standardized according to prosecutorial structure, removing hypothetical elements that had been necessary during analysis, but were no longer appropriate once the case had reached the conclusion stage. Closing the investigation was not understood as mere administrative action, but as a logical lock, where every critical question had been answered at a legal standard, and no gaps remained that would require the system to continue pursuit. Conclusions regarding criminal conduct, individual roles, chain of command and fatal outcome were presented clearly, consistently, and without contradiction, forming a closed file capable of withstanding any independent review. Once the investigation was completed operationally, the case file was transferred to the prosecution phase under proper authority. This handover was carried out with close coordination between the investigative agency and prosecutorial bodies to ensure all evidence, statements, and forensic conclusions were received in full without interruption or misinterpretation. The focus at this point was no longer on proving what happened, but on presenting it clearly, coherently, and systematically to serve the trial process. Investigators assumed a supporting role, explaining file structure, evidence collection methods, and applied investigative logic, but were no longer the ones actively driving the process. Control of the case shifted to the judicial system, reflecting the transition from truth-seeking to adjudication of responsibility under the law. Moving to prosecution marked a significant milestone. The case no longer existed in the open investigative space, but entered a phase where every conclusion would be tested against strict legal standards. Concurrently with the prosecutorial handover, the cold case file was officially closed in the archival system. This action carried deep symbolic and practical meaning, as it ended a case that had remained frozen for years. Closing the file did not mean erasing or shelving it, but changing its status from an unsolved matter to one that had been clarified and processed according to proper procedure. Cold case notations that once reflected impasse and lack of leads were replaced by clear conclusions about the nature of the incident. The archival system was updated to reflect the entire new process, ensuring that if the case were ever re-examined for any reason in the future, it would be viewed as one resolved at the investigative level. Closing the cold case file was not merely a technical step, but an official acknowledgement that the years-long silence had been broken and no longer existed as an unfilled void. During the case closure process, an equally important step was evaluating systemic shortcomings that had contributed to the matter remaining unresolved for so long. This evaluation was not intended to assign personal blame to those involved in the initial investigation, but to identify structural and contextual limitations. Factors such as technological constraints at the time of the incident, initial investigative assumptions that were reasonable, given the data then available, but proved inadequate in hindsight, and reliance on surveillance systems that were not yet fully developed were analyzed candidly. The fact that the vehicle could remain concealed for years without detection, or that an organized concealment structure existed outside the view of ordinary control mechanisms, was treated as a lesson in how sophisticated criminal conduct can exploit systemic gaps. These evaluations were recorded not to prolong the case, but to close it responsibly, ensuring that what occurred would contribute to improving how the system responds to similar cases in the future. Ending the investigative process also meant establishing the final boundary of the investigative narrative. No new branches were opened, no additional hypotheses were introduced for consideration, and no effort was made to interpret beyond what the evidence permitted. The team agreed that every core question, regarding the victim's fate, the nature of the conduct, the roles of involved individuals, and the concealment mechanism, had been adequately answered within the legal framework. Questions of ethics, emotion, or societal impact might continue to exist in the public sphere, but they no longer fell within the scope of the investigative process. Maintaining this boundary was necessary to ensure the case was closed through logic and fact, rather than prolonged by unverifiable speculation. When the final documents were signed and the archival systems updated, the case was officially marked as closed. For the investigative agency, this was the moment a long, complex, and multi-layered process ended, one in which persistence and restructuring had allowed what once seemed an unsolvable file to be brought into the light. Closing the case carried no sense of celebration, but rather of conclusion, an acknowledgement that the work had been completed within the limits permitted by law and evidence. There were no expansive declarations, no promises of further discoveries, only the affirmation that the process had reached its reasonable endpoint. The logical lock function of this phase was fully realized when the case was placed in a stable state, with no further investigative movement. From a vague disappearance, through years of being frozen, to a restructured and completed investigative chain, the case now existed as a complete file with a clear beginning, middle, and end. Closing the case did not erase the consequences or memories of what happened, but it ended the official system process, handing subsequent roles to other institutions such as the courts and society. Within the investigative framework, nothing further needed to be opened or re-examined, and that very finality was the last element ensuring the case ended not from exhaustion, but from having achieved logical and legal completeness. In the United States today, the story of Lauren Mitchell and Andrew Caldwell reminds us that safety sometimes does not lie in crowded places or seemingly thorough procedures, but in knowing how to leave proper traces and knowing how to demand that the system do its job. In this case, the couple left a wedding in a silver Range Rover and then vanished completely from all public records. The family reported to police early, but because there was no scene, no suspect, no phone or bank activity, the file quickly became a cold case. The first lesson is very practical. When traveling far or after major events, weddings, graduations, road trips, proactively create safety anchors, a check-in call sharing itinerary, destination, license plate with 1-2 trusted people. Not because you suspect anyone, but because if the worst happens, golden time will not be lost guessing the last confirmed sighting. The second lesson is the power and limitation of modern data. Only when 2008 historical satellite imagery revealed an unusual object under the lake and sonar confirmed it was man-made did the case shift from missing to physical trace. This reminds us in real life to legally preserve evidence, receipts, vehicle service history, home cameras, travel logs, small things that seem minor but can break the ice when the system is stuck. Finally, the story shows that concealment can be an entire structure, long-term storage maintenance, multiple participants, and only when investigation restructures and cross-references statements, physical evidence, forensics shallow grave, clothing comparison, homicide confirmation, is the silence broken. In American culture, trust your rights, pursue the file, ask again, request review, and when needed, get a lawyer advocate to help. Persistence is not bothering, it is protecting yourself and your loved ones. If this story has made you think about buried truth and the value of never giving up, please subscribe to the channel to continue joining us on the journey to seek justice for cases that seem to have fallen into oblivion. Thank you for taking the time to watch until the end, and see you in the next video with another story where the truth is once again brought into the light.